that wasn't invented by Samantha Power, but she sort of crystallized it in a book almost, I guess, 9 years ago. I guess it came out actually right around the time of 9/11. So it's almost a 10-year-old book. And she's now, as you probably know, is in the White House and advising President Obama on intervention, Libya, and things like that. The argument of Samantha Power and others is that the only real obstacle to effective humanitarian intervention is political will. And so essentially we have a debate between those who care about saving non-combatants and those who don't care. And if the folks who care win the day, we have sufficient political will to intervene, we save lives. That's it. And the point of my research and advocacy based on my research is that it's not that simple. And as I said to Professor Walzer today, I said this to Samantha Power before she published her book. I've been pals with her for a dozen years. And that hasn't changed her views, and I guess she hasn't changed my views. So there are two, aside from political will, there are two other major obstacles to effective intervention. And this is an unfortunate reality, but when you face that reality, it gives rise to a very different policy prescription for protecting non-combatants than we find in the responsibility to protect. So at the end of my talk today, I'll talk about how I think we need to modify the responsibility to protect. Okay, so first, I said there are two obstacles to effective intervention. The first one is that once genocidal violence starts, and I use this term genocidal violence, it means genocide, ethnic cleansing, those sorts of things. Once it starts, it often is perpetrated too quickly for humanitarian military intervention to stop it and prevent it. Okay, so for example, in Rwanda, which was the subject of my first book, the vast majority of the victims were killed in the first 3 weeks. In Kosovo, in 1999, when Milosevic launched his ethnic cleansing campaign in response to NATO's decision to intervene, he ethnically cleansed 850,000 Albanians from Kosovo, nearly half of their population, most of them in 2 weeks. In the Krajina region of Croatia, in August of 1995, when the Croatian government went on the attack, they ethnically cleansed virtually all the Serbs from that area in less than 1 week. In East Timor, after the independence referendum, when Indonesian-backed militias went on the attack, they destroyed 90% of the infrastructure in less than 1 week. Okay? So we see this destruction being perpetrated in 1 to 3 weeks. Well, what about intervention? Well, as I document in my book, if the US, which is the greatest military force on the planet and in human history, decides to intervene in an airborne military intervention, which is the fastest we can get there, it takes about 3 weeks to get sufficient force on the ground and operating to start saving lives in any sort of significant way. And so put these two things together, and what it means is that in a lot of cases, even if we have full political will, even if we intervene as quickly as possible, we will arrive too late to save most of the targets of violence. So just to illustrate it, as I did in my book, this is sort of the estimate of the number of Tutsi in Rwanda over time. And as I said, most of the killing was in this first 3-week period. I forgot to mention also, we don't always know immediately what's going on. And so it turns out it took about 2 weeks for us to figure out that there was a genocide going on in Rwanda. If we'd intervened at that point, troops could have arrived and started saving lives here. Okay, and what that means is that, sure, we would have saved maybe 100, 125,000 people, but the vast majority would have died anyway. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have intervened, and people sometimes mischaracterize my work as saying I would have opposed intervention in Rwanda. That's not my point. My point is that the benefit of intervention is much lower than advertised. And what that means is that we need to start paying close attention to the damage that's inflicted by intervention so that we can determine whether intervention will do more good than harm or vice versa. Which leads to the second obstacle that I mentioned. And that is that the emerging norm of humanitarian intervention, which we now refer to as the R2P, as it has been implemented since 1991, has backfired in a number of cases. These cases include Bosnia, Kosovo, and Darfur. Backfired by helping actually to cause or exacerbate the genocidal violence. And this is what I call the moral hazard problem. The root of the problem is that most genocidal violence is not like the Holocaust, in the sense the Holocaust was a case where we had an aggressive government that decided to attack a quiescent minority. That is not the way most genocidal violence arises. It usually arises because a sub-state group decides to take up arms against the state, either rebel or take up arms and secede. And then the state responds with violence, and the violence either deliberately targets civilians as a brutal counterinsurgency tactic, or targets the rebels but kills a lot of civilians along the way as collateral damage. The R2P, in such cases, calls for, demands intervention against the state. And actually, it demands intervention regardless of whether the state is intentionally targeting civilians or whether the state is merely killing a lot of civilians as collateral damage. The problem with this is that it rewards the rebels, it emboldens the rebels, it exacerbates the civil war, it exacerbates the retaliatory killing of civilians, but it doesn't actually stop or deter the state from perpetrating that retaliation until many, many people are killed. Not only does the R2P, as implemented, embolden rebels and secessionists to escalate their rebellions, in some cases, the rebels even intentionally provoke the state to retaliate against civilians in order to attract intervention. And Kosovo is a good example. And thus, my conclusion from this is that the R2P, as implemented, unintentionally causes some genocidal violence that otherwise would not occur. Cause is a strong term, but it means, from my perspective, means otherwise would not occur. Necessary condition. R2P is a necessary condition for some genocidal violence. This is sort of the way I set it up a long time ago, and I stick by this, and that is that oops, that wasn't good. There we go. Well, this is not working. But so we have this norm, this emerging norm. Sub-state actors rebel because they expect intervention. The states retaliate. The state retaliates, kills a lot of civilians, and oftentimes we eventually do intervene. It's too late to save most of the civilians, but we actually wind up helping the rebels achieve their political goal. And that just encourages more rebellions. Okay. There's another way of thinking about it. I was rereading my colleague's paper last night, and the argument was, I think you were making, and I think you reiterated it today, is that the R2P either does or should, I think in the paper you say does, call for intervention in cases of tyranny, such as the systematic deprivation of rights. And I don't think in practice that's correct. I think that in practice, in fact I know that in practice, the R2P, as you said in the resolutions that were adopted in the UN, requires large-scale violence against civilians, or the prospect of large-scale violence, in order to trigger the intervention mechanism. But this sets up a remarkably perverse incentive system. So that is, if you're living in a tyranny, you do not qualify for intervention. But if you're living in that tyranny and then you decide to provoke the government to retaliate in ways that kill civilians, and the way to do that is to yourself kill civilians or to kill members of the security services, that provokes the government to retaliate, and now you do qualify for intervention. So, a sub-state political movement can qualify itself for international assistance by engaging in murder. That's a heck of an incentive system. I don't qualify for intervention, but if I commit murder, then I can be helped. That makes no sense to me, ethically or practically. And so at the end of my presentation, I'll propose 5 reforms of the R2P, several of which aim to rectify this problem. So what's my evidence for these claims? My evidence is based heavily on my field research with rebels, asking them how and why they rebelled, what their strategy was, and so forth. So in Bosnia, it's a very, very weak movement that decided to arm itself and secede from Yugoslavia. The Muslims and the Croats were dwarfed militarily by the Serbs, and yet they decided not just to rebel, and when the Serbs cracked down in response, rather than cutting a deal and making peace quickly, the Bosnian Muslims fought for 3 years, 3.5 years. 100,000 people died in Bosnia. The largest group of those were Muslim civilians. So I asked, why? Why did you do this? And Omer Beckman, who is the eminent Grease of the Muslim political party, the power behind Alija Izetbegović, said to me quite clearly, the key was to put up a fight for long enough to bring in the international community. That is, they fought because of the prospect of intervention. As a result, people died because of the prospect of intervention. Similarly, in Kosovo, I interviewed the KLA, and I said, did you think that with your AK-47s you were going to defeat Serb tanks? And they said, no, of course not. We're not idiots. Emir Shumaili, one of the founders of the KLA and one of its commanders during the war, said, we knew our attacks would not have any military value. Our goal was not to destroy the Serb military force, but to make the enemy show its real face and become more vicious. We pursued a strategy to get the international community on our side. So once again, rebellion, escalation of rebellion, retaliatory violence. Why? Because of the prospect of intervention. And I think it's very important to look at the outcome from this case, because many people, the ISIS group from 2001 that you mentioned and that James Johnson mentioned yesterday, and I think James Johnson affiliated himself with their conclusion, which is that even though intervention wasn't authorized in Kosovo by the UN Security Council because of the Russia blocking it, even though it wasn't authorized, it was justified. So let's think about that. What actually happened as the result of intervention by NATO in Kosovo? Prior to the intervention, the level of civilian suffering was relatively moderate. Okay, and what I mean by that is that over the course of a year of war, approximately 100 persons a month were dying from the war. That includes rebels, soldiers, and civilians, 100 per month. During the course of the 3-month NATO intervention, the death rate went from 100 a month to 3,000 per month for 3 months. So multiplied the death rate by 30 times, the NATO intervention. The number of refugees, that is, legal refugees outside of the former Yugoslavia prior to the NATO intervention was about 30,000. After the NATO intervention, it was 850,000. So the number of refugees was multiplied also by about 30. And my question is, why is it justified to launch an intervention that increases the net harm to non-combatants? Last example is Darfur. Darfur is another case where there was a rebellion and a very brutal government retaliation, which I called in an op-ed in the Washington Post genocide in 2003. After 3 years of war, the US, through very heavy-handed diplomacy, forged a peace agreement. The peace agreement was signed by one of the rebel factions, of the 3 rebel factions, but it was rejected by the main rebel group. The leader of the main rebel group refused to sign the peace agreement that the government of Sudan had signed, and as a result, prolonged the fighting and the displacement of 2 to 3 million civilians. So Alex Duval, in this case, asked the leader of that rebel group, why didn't you sign? He said, oops, sorry. He said, I didn't sign.